Let's
Okay,
hear the presentation.
great. Well, thank you for having me today. Let me it says host has disabled participant screen sharing. Is it possible to change that, Sherry? Right window here. All right, where is it? There it is. Okie doke. All right, but let's start. Oops, let's start at the beginning. Okay, well, thank you again for having me. So as Sherry mentioned, I'm Rachel Jakuba. I'm the Vice President for Bay Science at the Buzzards Bay Coalition. And she asked me to tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing with salt marshes. So you all probably already are well aware that salt marshes are really valuable and important habitats. They're really productive areas. They act like filters. They provide a physical barrier for buffering storm and erosion flooding impacts. And they're really valuable habitat. And the map on the right shows in green the marsh areas around Buzzards Bay. Now, while these are really important environments, unfortunately, what we're seeing in a number of places is salt marsh loss. And this has a variety of different looks. So you can see in the top right here, we have this interior dieback. We can also have this calving off that you see on the lower right, or this dieback and widening of creeks in the lower left. And so all of these are a problem. One of the things that we've been focused on for the last couple of years is a potential way to address this upper left type of marsh loss. So as we have more water standing on the marsh due to sea level rise, if it stands on the marsh for too long and doesn't drain with the tide, it can drown the plants in place and create these dieback areas that have the potential to expand outward. So it works a little bit like a runaway train where you have vegetation by dieback. So there's a little bit of slight decrease in elevation, more water stays, and it's sort of, the problem compounds. So this idea to prevent this or to reverse this is an idea called runneling. And so runnels are really small channels that create a tidal connection between the shallow water areas or dieback areas and a creek or ditch. And we try to have them follow along topographical lows. And the idea is these are much smaller than a mosquito ditch. So they're generally about a foot deep and a foot wide, sometimes a little bit wider. And you're just draining the top part of the soil. You're not, fully draining the marsh. And this was really piloted by Wenley Ferguson at Save the Bay, Rhode Island. I should say for marsh restoration. She began piloting it about 10 years ago in Rhode Island. It's been used for mosquito control for decades before that. And these are some images from Wenley on the left from spring 2015 and on the right from fall 2019. And you can see this is an example of a really dramatic change where we go from standing water on the marsh to a really well vegetated marsh. And her anecdotal results, or anecdotal is not the right word, but the results she had seen and shared with people were really compelling and drove a lot of people to have an interest in this technique. Wenley, she's a restoration ecologist and she's focusing on trying to make places better. But one of the things there have been a number of concerns, and we know that in Massachusetts, the regulatory environment can be very rigorous. And so just because something's worked one place, if there's not really good detailed results that describe what happened and also, provide data about potential harmful impacts, then it's very difficult to get things permitted in Massachusetts. So recognizing this, we wanted to work on this idea and think about its potential application in Massachusetts and Buzzards Bay. And so we started with, we started with a workshop March 2020. We made it just before the pandemic hit. We were able to have an in-person meeting where we gathered a bunch of people from around Buzzards Bay and also some people from Rhode Island and Long Island who had experience using runnels in marshes for restoration purposes. And so the idea of this was to really get the the scientists, the regulators, managers, landholders on the same page about what runnels are and what they aren't, and where they have application and where they're not necessarily appropriate. And we have a postdoc, Alice Besterman, working with us right now on this project. And so she developed an article that came out of this workshop that really tried to document the history of the use of runnels. What are these, things that runnels are and things that runnels aren't, and what are the research questions that we still need to answer. This article also included data from one of Wenley's marshes, the Winnapaug Marsh in Rhode Island, and so showed a trajectory of vegetation restoration over time. So we got funding from the EPA, from the SNEP program, to put in some test pilots in Buzzards Bay so that we could try it here. And we wanted to, in addition to piloting the technique in a couple sites here, to also try and look at all of our marshes and try and put in context, well, where would runnels work in our marshes and where wouldn't they? And so with the funding from SNEP, we chose 2 sites and actually got feedback from that workshop from the people in the room about site selection. So one is Ocean View Farm in Dartmouth, and the other is Little Bay, Fairhaven. And so at these 2 sites, we have 5 experimental transects and 5 reference transects. So that is to say there are 5 transects where we're measuring a dieback area that we've treated with a runnel, and 5 where we're not treating that dieback area with a runnel. So it's total, across the 2 sites, it's 20 total transects. And we're measuring a number of metrics. So vegetation, where you have photo stations, elevation, soil, water level, a whole bunch of stuff to try and, again, to really develop the information to give the regulators in Massachusetts confidence, if the results are good, I should say, that this technique is something that could work here. And so this is just a close-up, a zoom in of the 2 sites, so you can see a little bit what they look like. So on the, I'm just trying to move this, great. Okay, so on the top here, this is our Ocean View Farm site. And so the purple transects, that's where we do our monitoring. The blue line is my squiggly drawing of the runnel in each of these cases. So the green transects are where there was no treatment, and the purple are where there's treatment. And you can see some of these have stars because with the 20 transects, we couldn't do everything everywhere. So the ones that are starred are more intensive transects where we did more measurements. So the runnels were created in October and November 2020, and they were modified a little bit through the winter to make sure that the water was draining the way we wanted it to, and they weren't getting clogged. And then we have funding to monitor through at least 2023. Okay, now I want my slide advanced. There we go. Okay, so these are some images from the installation of the runnels. So depending on the site, the distance, the existing peat in place, we either dug the runnels by hand, and so you can see here we have people, out with shovels digging this runnel here, or in some cases we used an excavator. So the excavator is a really specialized excavator that Bristol County Mosquito Control has. So it's low ground pressure. The treads of this excavator put less pressure per square inch than a foot does of an average person. And they were one of our partners that were really helpful in this project. And like I said, depending on the degradation of the peat and the length of the runnel was how we sort of decided whether to do hand or with the excavator. All right, so now I want to jump to some of our results. So this graph, so we've got water level on the y-axis and date on the x-axis, and the blue trace is the sort of every 15 minutes water level. And then the green line is what we're using as a proxy for the water table, which is the daily minimum of the water. And the dashed line here at 0, that's the marsh surface. And so what you can see is before the runnel, here we have these periods of standing water for, you know, a significant period of time. And there's my graphic to highlight that. And then this is data from the same site after the runnel was dug. And what you can see is there's still and I didn't really point out, but there's the daily tidal flooding you can see in the short-term flux, and you still see that after the runnel is dug. But what you see is that the water table is staying below the marsh surface. So the water is draining as a natural marsh would. So those are some results showing the water level and how we've changed the conditions that we would hope would impact vegetation. We weren't actually sure that we would see any impact after 1 year of digging the runnels. So we're going out in 2 weeks to do our 2022 monitoring. So we only have data post runnel installation data from the first year post installation, and that's 2021. But so these images show what the vegetation looks like before and after. So on the left, we have these two images are ocean view, and on the right, these two images are Little Bay. And you can see on top, we have the before, and in the bottom, we have after. And so you can see that we have, here we have this, a large amount of standing water. There's still a little bit of standing water a year after the runnel, but not nearly as much. And we've seen that the vegetation has been able to creep in there. And the same over at Little Bay. Here it was a more sort of dispersed feature. So you can see it's kind of long and not one perfect pool. And there's not as much standing water, there's not as thick standing water, but there is this vegetation dieback. And you can see the sediment surface kind of looks shiny, looks wet. Whereas after the runnel, we have a bunch of the vegetation filling in, again, after only 1 year. So we're really encouraged by these results, that this technique can be a valuable thing to use here in Buzzards Bay. So some takeaways so far from what we know. So first, one thing is just that our marshes, and thinking about sort of how this could be used to provide evidence to regulators. So our marshes are not fundamentally different from Rhode Island. We're not seeing something, the outcomes we're seeing in Buzzards Bay are similar to what has been seen in Rhode Island, which is very encouraging. There's a different response rate based on elevation and depth. So I showed you that we had 20 sites. What I didn't really say is that some of those sites, the degradation or the size of the dieback area is larger than others. And there are different elevation gradients along those 20 sites. And we are seeing that ones that are sort of less far down the path of degradation are so far seem to be recovering faster, which is perhaps what you'd expect. Another thing that we really, as we got more and more into this project, we had wanted to be able to think on sort of a large scale about which marshes runnels would be appropriate and which they would be less appropriate, and could we sort of, look at big factors, watershed sort of scale factors to determine where we should pilot this or use this technique. And the more we did it, it's a very sort of, surgical precision technique where you're targeting single dieback areas. And so it's very difficult to try and use a large scale metrics to decide where a runnel is going to work and where it isn't. You kind of really have to be on the ground looking very specifically at a marsh and a portion of a marsh. And so runnels, we think, are a valuable tool in the overall marsh management scheme. They're not going to solve all the problems. So again, they treat, I showed multiple types of dieback that we're seeing around Buzzards Bay. This treats one of those. And it, depends on the exact marsh, whether it's going to work well or not. But in the scheme of overall marsh management, we think this is really valuable. Okay, so project design is still highly context specific. So again, you kind of have to be on the ground and understand what the characteristics of that marsh are. And it's a hard thing. We've tried in the Alice's paper to really document our learnings, but without it, basically what we try to do is regulate or replicate Wenley Ferguson's knowledge onto a piece of paper. And that's just really difficult to do. And we've learned so much from her. And we think it's really, without her guidance, I doubt this project would have been so successful. And so we think it's really important that new projects involve people who have some expertise or experience doing these to help guide new projects. Some of the things that are detailed in that paper are best management practices, and these are really critical. So for the runnels, we dig them in phases. So you don't, you try and do as little as possible. And so that's where we started digging, in October 2020. But as we sort of went back over time and saw like, oh, well, there's still some water standing here. If I can, do a little bit more of a runnel this way. And maybe at that point, it's only 10 centimeters as opposed to, a foot. So it's only 6 inches depth to get that very, the very center of the pool. We use sills at the end of the runnel. So the runnel, to try and maintain sediment on the platform, we really, the marsh sediment's really valuable. We don't want to lose it. So we try and put like speed bumps on the end of our runnels to prevent sediment from washing away. It's important that the runnels are, they're maintained. So there's something that they're not a set and forget solution. There's something you have to go back every year and make sure it's still draining. And if it's clogged, if a chunk of sediment had fallen in, and you would want to remove that and make sure that the water's still draining. And the other thing to think about is, in terms of where the runnel is placed, be mindful of how much sort of wind and wave velocity there is coming into the end of that runnel, because you want to be conscious of potential erosion and making sure that where you place the runnel is not going to be subject to a lot of fetch that would drive erosion. So those are that's the quick summary of what we've been doing and what we've found so far. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And this project has been a really huge collaboration from a number of people, and wouldn't have been possible without any of our project partners. So I just want to acknowledge the project team here. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So we got questions? No questions?
It was so clear.
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is that how is this, or why is this different than what used to be done to drain the marshes and get rid of the mosquitoes?
So it's a much shallower, a mosquito ditch is often sort of 2 to 3 feet deep, depending on where you are. And here we're only talking about a foot, and they're generally narrower as well. So you're not over draining the marsh, which the mosquito ditches can do. So it's really this sort of, you need to do enough to affect a difference, but not so much that you are over drying the marsh.
Okay.
So Rachel, you're going to continue to monitor these?
We are.
And in the same water bodies, or are you going to expand at all, or not right now?
I mean, so we only have test runnels at these 2 locations. And so we're going to monitor these at least for another, so including this year, 3 more years. So we'll have 4 years of data in the end of for these sites.
How was the permitting for this? I'm sorry. How was the permitting for this?
So we were very fortunate to have mosquito control as a partner. So Bristol County Mosquito Control took the lead on permitting, which they have a lot of experience on. They also have some, they have some more flexibility to do this than a town or the Vineyard Commission would be able to do. And so they're certainly a valuable partner to consider. And they were pretty key in, they just also know how to do this kind of permitting. So, but it takes a while. I think I'd have to think back, but it took us on the order of 6 months. It wasn't a full year that it took us to permit it, but it was around 6, maybe even a little bit more months. We were planning to dig the runnels, and like those last permits had to, they needed to come in within a week for us to dig when we were planning to, and thankfully they did, but it was a little nerve-wracking at the end.
Yeah.
Where? Greg, did you have a question?
Hi, I've got a question, Rachel. I'm John Shirless. I want to thank you for your presentation. Actually, I have two questions. The first is, are there other sites where this sort of technique is being used anywhere on the East Coast or indeed abroad? Or is it initially unique to Rhode Island and then replicated by you? And then the second question is, what does it look like when you factor in, say, how things will look in 20 years given sea level rise?
Yeah, so those are good questions. So it was a technique that was actually initially applied in Australia for mosquito controls, where it was first trialed. It's also been used in Long Island and I believe Florida. And they're doing it now, actually. Before we started, so like I said, it's gained a lot of interest in the last 5 years. So before we started, I'm not sure if there had been any projects in New Hampshire, but there are now. So it's in the Northeast, it's wrapped. There's like a lot of runnels going in right now, or in the last year, and in the planning phase. So it's really gaining traction and speed. And your second question about the long-term trajectory for these runnels, or I guess really the long-term trajectory of these marshes is, again, this is a piece of the puzzle. There's one of the ways that's been used in addition to try and, gain regrowth is to also provide for marsh migration. So, I mean, realistically, in thinking about the rates of sea level rise, I mean, we have to think about marsh migration or we're not going to have marshes. That's just the reality of it. And so there has been some use of bringing, starting to bring the saltwater a little bit into upland areas in order to facilitate marsh migration, to sort of like jumpstart the process to try and give these marshes a little bit of a head start, because they're going to need all the help they can get.
Is anyone looking at how runnels affect the rate of sediment accretion and change in marsh elevation?
Yes, so we're measuring marsh elevation, and we've done some sediment accretion. We've done sediment deposition. So we put out filters and looked at sediment deposition. We only have 1 year of data. The elevation, we're not seeing any change in the elevation, but I wouldn't expect to in a single year. Interestingly, when we put out the filters, it looks like there may be, this is very preliminary results, though, so you can't hold me to this, but it looked like if anything, the runnels may have promoted sediment deposition, as opposed to, one of the concerns was, could the runnels help wash away material, which we don't want to do. Again, we want to keep all the sediment on the marsh because the marshes need it. And it does not look like that's a problem, which is great. And maybe they're even promoting sediment deposition. But again, that's very preliminary results.
All right, anybody else?
I hate to ask this question. Maybe I'm just afraid of the answer. I think that everyone who's on this call, and thank you so much. And this is really, really promising, and really exciting to see this work. I think everyone on this call can think of a couple places around the island where we're watching this happen. We're watching this dieback, and seeing the water accumulate and stay there during low tide. How do we go about starting the process of getting runnels put in? Do you think it's still an experimental phase that we need to be really sensitive to that, or can we start seriously talking about getting it done?
I think you can start seriously talking about getting it done. Gosh, now I'm like, oh man, this is all recorded. I get myself in trouble. But I think, well, let's put it this way. So we only have 1 year of data. The initial results are really encouraging. And there are a number of projects around Massachusetts that have sought permitting and been successful with permitting. So I think that, I think that there's no reason you couldn't do it. What I would say is if you guys are seriously interested, it'd be good to plan a site visit after the sort of summer craziness is done. But if you guys come over and see our runnels, you know, we can show you like what types of, there's no substitute for being on the ground with someone who knows these runnels well. And I say that as someone who, you know, had read a lot about them, but it was like when I was on the ground with Wenley Ferguson, I was like, okay, now I get it. And you just, you know, you can talk about some of the intricacies. So, you know, we'd be happy to have you come over and show you our sites after the summer clears.
Thanks.
Hey, Paul, go ahead.
Hey, where to start locally is with the Conservation Commission. In Edgartown, we used to have mosquito management until around the mid-70s. Last mosquito ditch digger that we had is Timmy Thomas, and he's still kicking around. So there's a network of mosquito ditches, and as you've already heard, this is a shallower solution. But if you already have a backbone, so to speak, of channels, and we've had limited success, albeit undocumented, from about 10 years ago. If you go to the bend in the road and you look towards Central Kentucky, you notice that there's a larger scar towards the big bridge than there is once you get past Jaime Crow, which is that headland right at the bend in the road. The other side does not have that scarring because the ditches were dug out in a manner to create only shallow drainage. So, you know, it's an undocumented success, but the place to go is the local Concoms. I'm sure Oak Bluffs has a similar type of plan somewhere in the far distant past for mosquito control. Unfortunately, they used to dig the ditches and then pour diesel fuel in them to take care of the mosquitoes. So fortunately, we're not doing that anymore. But it's certainly a solution for a lot of areas on the Vineyard.
Is there any way, Rachel, that you could, those big trenches that were dug for mosquitoes, is there any way that you could fill those back in?
Yep. So there are some people looking at ditch remediation, and they've, you know, there are a number of ways people have done that. So like sometimes they'll go and, you know, mow the hay at the end, the salt marsh hay at the end of the season, and like make, you know, bundles of it and sort of put them in, you know, plug all along the ditch. And there is, the Mass Audubon is actually looking at that at a location in the Buzzards Bay watershed. I haven't actually made it out with them yet to see. I think they're still in the permitting phase. But so there is some discussion of ditch remediation. It's not something we've gotten into yet, but people are talking about it and looking into it.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see anybody else. Thank you very
Right.
much.
You're welcome. Pleasure
Yes,
to talk to you all.
thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, have a good rest of your.
Sorry,
meeting.
we jumped right into the presentation for the meeting, but Rachel has another meeting this afternoon, so she gave us a few minutes of her time. So that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure. Bye, everyone.
Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. May I ask a question to follow up what Paul said relating to all this about the mosquito ditches?
Yep.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if one could take an optimistic view and, I don't know, perhaps the Martha's Vineyard Commission could play a role in creating a map or compendium of all the known extant mosquito ditches, you know, where the work was done, and then follow up on Paul's point about possibly, you know, plans languishing in towns like Oak Bluffs, to compile all this information to sort of get a head start on what might be feasible to follow up from all this.
So may I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I missed the first part, which was about 10 minutes, which was rather critical, but I don't understand the negative aspect of the mosquito ditches. I mean, they allow tidal flow to come in and out and maintains the vibrancy of the saltwater marshes. It allows aqua life in there. It does function effectively to reduce mosquitoes. So I didn't understand the kind of what I'm hearing now, which is sort of an anti-mosquito trenching, when I sort of have seen the utility of the mosquito trenches in terms of the vibrancy of the saltwater ponds where we are. So can you help me on that?
The thought that I had just now was that if they're deep enough, maybe because they'd be so deep, the water would fill in the trenches, but not necessarily flow into the marsh. Do you think that's, so it's not going to flood the marshes as much with those deep ditches? I don't know.
The idea with the shallow ditches is that it floods the marsh, and that's what they're looking for in order to make the marsh more vibrant. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's what I sort of, that's what I've got thinking of. I wonder, does anybody know when they cut those mosquito ditches, how deep were they? They were pretty deep, weren't they?
Yeah, I think generally they're around 2 to 3 feet below whatever the surface of the marsh is. But there's also, to answer your question, James, is none of the mosquito ditches are maintained. So if they start a maintenance program with an eye to draining the pools without totally draining the marsh, that could offer some relief.
Yeah.
So the idea is, or the fear is that those trenches drain the marshes? Is that what the concern is?
James, maybe what you missed in the beginning was this is for areas that pond in the middle of the marsh, and they're trying to drain those because when they pond and the water stays there for a long time, that aren't anywhere near the mosquito ditches, these ponding areas. When the water stays there and doesn't drain off, then the area dies and then it starts growing. So this is just to drain those small areas that are ponding, mostly due to sea level rise. And so I think maybe does that help? You might have missed that.
Yeah, I didn't.
Okay.
So that is critical. So if you have marshes and you've got mosquito ditches or other trenches, and the flow is coming back and forth, and there is no captured pond, if you will, in the middle that would kill off the marsh, then you're fine. It's only targeted then towards ponds that are sort of created in the middle, and that kills the marsh. Is that?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay.
That was my understanding. Anybody else? Richard?
I actually just Googled this because it's not been very clear to me. I've heard the mosquito ditches are not seen terribly favorably anymore, and I didn't quite understand it. And so I Googled it while we're sitting here. And what I'm finding is basically the simple fact that the ditches alter the natural processes, including how the sediment, the marsh elevation, and how the sediment moves around. And this is like inlandbays.org, just where I ended up, and just saying that they hasten degradation and die off of the wetlands. And altered water levels also cause large-scale changes in marsh plant communities, affecting populations, birds, and other wildlife. I needed that personally.
Wow. Interesting. All right, anybody else on this topic? Sherry, what else we got on the agenda?
I have Emma's going to give us an update with the shellfish, how her hatch how her spawnings went, how many babies she put out, and any other project with the eelgrass project that she's working on. And I don't know, there's several members of different pond groups here, so if they would like to give a quick update on anything, we haven't really heard from the pond groups. I know TWI is here, Friends of Senji is here, and Shellmark Pond is here. So if anybody, and the tribe is here, Becky, thank you. So if anybody has any announcements or anything, do we want to do that first, or we want to go right to Emma?
Emma, you in a hurry?
No, I think you should, I'd love to hear from everybody else first.
Okay, well, let's just go around the room and see if just put your hands up, who wants to, who has some news that we can share with everybody? Don't see anybody? You don't see,
I can
Nothing
give-
like putting people on the spot. Hi, Amy,
can-
thank you.
Hi, sorry. I'm Chilmark Pond, and I can give you a tiny update. We may have found cyano today
oh
in the
boy,
middle pond. We're gonna have it tested. Someone sent me a picture that looked pretty green and slimy.
oh boy.
Yeah, it's been hot, as you all know too well, hot and dry. So prime conditions. And I think I've reported this already, but I just wanted to make sure that the Chilmark Pond Foundation has applied for a dredge permit, and it is under review with the Department of Environmental Protection. They promised to really start looking at it. They've had it for a couple of months, but they promised to start looking at it for real next week. So there is some chance that we will have permission to dredge mostly around where we ordinarily open the cut to the ocean, mostly where the sand matches the sand on the beach. But it's possible if we get permissions and we find a dredger and we find someone who knows how to dredge, that, in the next year or year and a half, we will have better tidal exchange when the pond is open to the ocean in Chilmark.
That's great. Does anybody have any idea? I know it's still early in the season, but all of a sudden it's very hot, as you all know. Have we reached the temperature that we were at last year, or is it not that high yet, the temperatures? Because that's what it's all about, right?
In the water?
Yeah, the ponds.
We're definitely warm enough to support big growth of algal blooms. The conditions are right, I think, in all the ponds, and I think Sherry's monitoring more ponds than we are, but all the ponds that we're monitoring as part of MV Cyano are perfectly conditioned to start happening. And there is, I believe, even more, I think the conditions are even more prone to a bloom up in Squibnocket by the public kayak launch.
Oh, boy.
Sherry,
No.
have you guys got more information?
Becky would be the one to talk about the Squibnocket area. Becky, have you seen anything? We're actually going out there next week, but have you seen anything yet?
I know that Marcella and I were talking last week, and she did see something. So she she collected samples and has been looking at everything under the scope to see if she can identify, or to see what she identifies when she's looking. But she would be the best person to talk to about this. I know she saw something last week that made her just stop and collect. I didn't say any of that well, but you know what I mean.
Thank
the
you.
other- The other problem that I know we're all experiencing is we really haven't had any rain. We haven't had any fresh water entering the ponds, which is not a good thing, right? I mean, it's not washing fertilizer into the ponds, but I don't know, scary.
Tisbury Great Pond was opened on Friday, so that'll be kind of interesting because all of the, what will be coming in right now is just all groundwater. It is open, so it is flushing, but it's going to get a big influx of groundwater.
Good. Good. Anybody else got any updates? James? Nothing from James.
I can ask a question.
Yep.
Since we're all here on the topic of Squibnocket Pond. Who, is there someone now who is a Squibnocket? Is there a Squibnocket Pond entity as such, and whom would one contact about it?
I think it depends on what you're looking for.
There is a
a
Squibnocket, a pond advisory group. And then definitely the tribe, Marcella would be definitely the one to contact, Marcella and Andrew and Becky.
And the advisory group is sort of, well, I don't know. I think one interesting aspect of it is that it's an instrument of like one of the planning boards. And so there might be like a chair from the Chilmark side and a chair from the Aquina side. Something like that. But it's not, they don't operate, it's not quite the same as any of the other pond groups.
Right. In fact, when I looked online, I got the impression that it was an ephemeral entity, just sort of created for a particular purpose at the time. So I don't know if it still continues.
There is it has a long acronym, right? Let's see. They met, was it this winter? Or was it longer ago than that? Yeah, they don't meet terribly often. And I feel like the last meeting was very much about general conversation and just catching up. In fact, there wasn't like a very clear mission behind the meeting, which I think that in the past maybe there was. So it sort of exists.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to remember when they put in the new access out to the land on Squibnocket there, did they put any kind of a drainage or any kind of a way if the pond did need to be flushed to go to the ocean? No.
Not through the beach side there, no. The only way that it flushes is through the herring run that goes into Menemsha Pond.
That's too bad.
And we've had, especially in the the 208 group that the commission was working on, we've had this conversation in the Squibnocket group about some other way, to get it to flush it. And but any like culvert or something like that out to the ocean side, well, it would fill with sand, first of all, so it'd be tricky to maintain. And then there was just the real, I think it's still really interesting to a lot of people, or the idea of perhaps purposely breaching it to the ocean to get some real serious flushing on that end of the pond, but it would completely change the ecology of the pond. I mean, yes, there's cyanobacteria, there's too much Phragmites, there's way too many nutrients, too much nitrogen. But there are other things there that are meant to be there. And if you brought in a ton of salt water pretty quickly, it would really change things. So,
Yeah, there's a real active herring run there, so
you don't want to mess with that way too much.
no.
It's tricky.
Yep, and we haven't had any bad storms that would, do it on its own, so.
Right.
That's twice in 2 days you've said something like that to me, Richard. Don't tell me again.
I know. I feel that this weather is going to end with something interesting. Who knows? Who knows?
Similar questions have been asked of, the upper Chilmark ponds. And of course, Amy could speak to this more because the upper pond, middle and upper pond of the Chilmark pond system, they don't get the salt water that even when the main Chilmark pond is open and, when they're if and when their dredging is successful and they have better flushing, that salty water isn't going to make its way up Doctor's Creek into Middle Pond so it's not going to necessarily have a positive impact on the Middle Pond, which gets really funky. And so should those ponds be open to the ocean? And the answer is, again, the same. It gets washed over during storms and breaches during big storms naturally. But if you were to open it on purpose, I don't know, it would really change the ecology. It would drain out the nutrients. It'd make the water cleaner in lots of ways, but it would change things.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think when we get better drainage and flushing, even in the lower pond, as Sherry was just saying, or someone was just saying about now that Tisbury is open, it will allow this groundwater, the dirty groundwater, to come through faster. So it may actually benefit the water quality, even though it's mostly a freshwater system in the upper two parts of Chilmark Pond. But it's I mean, people are interested in opening a cut deliberately in the middle pond. And I think way back in the olden days, we used to open it. We didn't. People used to open it even up at Lucy. And Lucy, I don't know if anybody's been there recently. It's kind of creating its own channel up there. I mean, it's not quite a channel, but there's no dune at all. There's been so much washover in the last couple of winters that I think nature may create her own way of getting in there. And that, you know, arguably is a good thing. It's a different ecological system because it's fresh water up there. So we have to learn more about what restoration of the upper pond looks like. It's a little easier with the lower pond because we do open it up and we think of it as brackish. And we hope that we will have some shellfish down in there sometime soon, but we do need to, it is one system with very different characteristics, and we're still just learning about it.
Were there any oysters there years ago?
Apparently there were, I mean, Chris Murphy can speak to it, but yeah, there used to be oysters at least in the bigger part of the pond, the bigger lower part. And soft shell clams, as I call them. Yeah, lots of things to harvest, and fish. There's still fish in there. And an occasional oyster. I mean, you see oyster shells, so there's something going on down there. It's just, I think the acidity levels are probably too high for the shells to develop well. Don't know.
And now it's so mucky, there's no hard substrate for the oysters to set onto, which is what they need. And when
Yeah,
the pond's been open and it gets really, really low, you'll find dead, you know, the remnants of oysters leaving their mark on rocks and whatnot. But then when the pond's open for a while, those are exposed. So even if they were alive when the pond was opened, so the hard substrate exists in this space that then gets exposed when the pond's open. So that if there were oysters on the hard substrate, now they're dead.
got it.
So it's a tricky place to exist for.
Well, and one of the things that I want to find out more about is something I think that someone once talked about in this, on one of these calls, which is the beneficial use of dredge material to improve the marshes. Because if we could find a way, one of the problems that we're having in the dredging application is that we wanted to dredge some of the muckier stuff that's on the landward side of the pond, which would really improve the flow a lot. And the DEP folks and the endangered species folks said no, because it doesn't match the sand on the beach. And our current disposal plan for the dredge material is just to put it on the beach, because trucking out 100 pickup dump trucks full of muck doesn't really seem feasible at Chilmark Pond. But I was looking into this. They've been spraying it. There's some pilot programs where they've been spraying the muck onto the marshes, and it does a great job of restoring them. It gives them more height. The stuff that Greg was asking about in terms of whether these smaller, whatever these ditches were called that we were just hearing about, these runnels, whether that could be complemented by the use of beneficial dredge muck to improve the condition of the adjacent marshlands. But as the speaker mentioned, permitting in Massachusetts is a bitch.
You're being nice.
And unfortunately around Chilmark Pond, so much of it's Phragmites.
Well, yeah, but a lot of it, I was thinking all the land that is owned by the Sheriff's Meadow people own much of the land at the east end. And that could be a wonderful location to spray muck.
Yeah, that's worth a try.
I think it's called thin layer deposition.
Thin layer deposition, that. I'm
That's
writing
what
that
Layer
down.
deposition, how would we get a permit for that?
Well, they got one in Rhode Island, so maybe the folks we were just talking to who got a pilot project permit for what they were doing, we can figure out how to do it, but I think it would be something that all of the ponds and the marsh areas on the vineyard could benefit from.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, there must be a way to distribute it thinly, thinly.
They just spray it. I mean, I've seen videos of it. It's like a hose, a big
Wow,
hose, and they just and
wow,
spray it atop the existing marshes, and it just adds a lot of good nutrition and height to them.
wow, that's great.
And I think I heard somewhere that like a healthy marsh or even a moderately healthy marsh can take something like up to maybe 4 inches and grow right through it. So actually
Wow.
that's
It's really cool
quite a bit.
stuff.
Wow.
If it's something that could be done like every couple of years, it'd be so neat.
Yeah, that would be. But we know from the eelgrass that there is definitely a maximum that they can take before they're covered and they can't grow back through.
Right.
So, yeah, that's the tricky part is just make sure it's a thin layer of deposition, not a buried it.
Oh, it's tricky.
Yeah.
That's what they do on the golf course. They cover the greens in sand. Just plain old sand, but doesn't kill anything. Anybody else? Any updates? Thoughts they want to share? I don't see anybody. So Emma, why don't you go ahead with what you had?
Well, let's say overarching themes so far this season, we definitely had a hard time. We've had the hard time spawning both oysters and bay scallops. We did find success, but we've already done, well, in total, we've already done 6 bay scallop spawns this year. And what's something that just always worries me when something like this happens, when it feels like the timing is right and perhaps the gonad looks almost right, but not quite, and they just don't want to spawn. To us, that often means that there's something blooming out there in the ponds. Whatever their food source is, just isn't quite right. And that's just really worrisome in general, because we just know that phytoplankton communities can change on like an hourly basis, much faster than any of us can monitor. And it's not that so we are now engaged in phytoplankton monitoring network, which is a NOAA program, getting used to that system. And we're basically just filtering the water, putting it under the microscope, taking pictures. There's an app that goes along with it, but being part of the network allows us that if we do see something alarming, we can send it to NOAA and they will help identify it. And it also just goes into their database. So if we see something alarming, they now know about it. So we're just trying to add to everyone else's, all the information that everyone else is trying to collect. And in the shellfish world, we end up finding that a lot of these things are regional. These patterns that we see end up being something that others in the whole region are seeing. But we don't know that now because we're all in our bubble and we're just working. And it's not until next winter when we go to some conference, we talk to other people, go, oh, really? Oh, I had this issue. And then someone else goes, oh my goodness, me too. And then you realize that, that lots of people have the same issue, whatever it may be. But by then, you can't go back and figure out what it was. So everyone in the community is trying to, collect more data, keep better records, and then share those things. If, the hatchery, we have log books that go back to 1977 when Rick first started growing stuff. They're all in the desk in Rick's lovely handwriting. It's not that they ever went anywhere. They're just sort of for us. So we're trying to, just share these things more. So the phytoplankton monitoring network is something that we're excited about because we tried last year and just could not find the time to get into it. Let's see. I mean, of course, we're still doing lots of oyster restoration in Eggertown and Tisbury Great Ponds. Our oyster larvae is getting ready to set right now. So we'll be We're setting up those tanks on Conomica Point and Eggertown Great Pond and Manters Point and Tisbury Great Pond. It's where these tanks have always been. If you're out in the pond cruising around, that's what those are. And so the tanks will be full of bags of clean oyster shell that we've collected through our shell recycling program. That goes around to a whole bunch of restaurants and a few raw bar caterers and collects all their shell. And then we clean it up, put it into these tanks and put the oyster larvae in and turn all these castaway shells into clusters of oysters. We also have a barrel at the old lobster hatchery here at the Hughes hatchery. Sits in the parking lot for anyone to come drop their shells off. Chris Vrooman's on the call from FOS. We call Chris is like one of our prime, and Richard too, prime shell angels. We love seeing people drop off shell. And we're finding new people who find it handy all the time. And it's really contributing to our efforts a lot. We're working with the Nature Conservancy still to try to do another SOAR program. SOAR stands for Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration. And that was a program that the Nature Conservancy did throughout the region, maybe throughout the country. It was initially funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, and now they're looking for other funding to essentially buy cast off oysters from the aquaculture industry, whether they be after COVID, it was the stuff that was way too big for them to sell, that they were just going to, throw away. Their neighbors don't want any more big oysters. And so the Nature Conservancy provides this funding so that we can buy excess oysters from the farmers and then replant it into restoration sites. And so just trying to work on this partnership, and instead of duplicating this infrastructure, like the Shellfish Group, we can only grow so many oysters. So only have so much capacity. But then we have farmers nearby who have anything that's not perfect for a raw bar gets given away, thrown away. Some of them have systems where they give it to the shellfish constables if they're in the same pond, and they plant them in family areas, but there's still more. So if we can use that product, to get on with our mission, then everyone wins. So we're still doing a little more of that. We're trying to get into to a bigger eelgrass restoration project. We've been dabbling in a couple different techniques over the past couple of years, seeing quite a few small successes, also lots of heartbreaks. Eelgrass is really tough, in the places where they're now having really great successes, like in the Chesapeake Bay area. They have put in millions and millions and millions of dollars over decades. And they planted tons of seeds and shoots. And they've also made incredible moves to reduce the nitrogen loading to the estuaries. Because that's why the eelgrass dies, is because the water quality is too poor, mostly because there's too much nitrogen and hypoxia and too much phytoplankton and macroalgae clogging the water column that the eelgrass can't compete and can't live. And so, on the Vineyard, we know this is what we're all working on, is finding ways to reduce the nitrogen inputs and increase the flushing and things like that. And we're not quite there yet. Eelgrass has come back in Eggertown Great Pond, because they did all of those things. The town increased, they put more, was it 70? Paul's on the call. Paul, this is what Paul gives me these numbers. Eggertown spent tens of millions of dollars to upgrade their sewage treatment plant over 20 years ago, put 70 more homes onto sewer and took them off of private septics in the Eggertown Great Pond watershed. And Great Pond Foundation was doing all that dredging, so that when the town opened the beach, they were getting good flushing. So the eelgrass is beautiful in Eggertown Great Pond, and everywhere else it's still declining. So our main methods are, we collect these, basically they're uprooted, like flotsam eelgrass plants. Where you see them the most, where they collect the highest density, is like in Menemsha Harbor. In between all the boats, you see lots of eelgrass blades and all kinds of trash and gross things. And underneath, it's usually at the layer underneath the floating blades, there's a lot of plants. with rhizomes and roots. And those never get the chance to replant themselves. They just eventually end up on the beach, in the rack line and dry out and die. And so we're recovering those and replanting those. And we tried replanting them in a couple different ways. Right now, the method that we really like for a number of reasons is we use it's the same thing as a quahog raft, what all the constables, all the shellfish departments use to plant quahogs in. It's a sheet of plywood surrounded by 2x6 wood and filled with sand and floated from the surface. And instead of planting 1 millimeter quahogs in there, we are swimming down with masks on and planting these salvaged eelgrass plants into the rafts. And one time when this was, lots of things can go wrong, in the lagoon, sorry, I'm pointing because I'm right here at the lobster hatchery. The lagoons has very few protected areas. So our rafts have gotten hammered by storms, things like that. But one year it was really successful, and the number of blades, shoots increased by about 30%. So that was just enough to show us, like, okay, so when we plant these sad plants, which have been through hell and back, some of them floating around for a while in the harbors, we're able to replant them and they actually start to establish themselves and send out new shoots. So that's really positive. And so then now we have to find a way to get those onto the bottom, right? And the other way we're doing it is seed dispersal. And seed dispersal is basically the most efficient way to do this. And I remember when I worked for the commission one summer as an intern, going out into Sendiconnecticut with Bill Wilcox and Dave Grendon. I would row into like Cow Bay and collect these eelgrass seed shoots, put them in these bags and put them into Sendiconnecticut. And then we went out there looking for baby eelgrass to see if these seed bags were working. And that year there was, 12, 18 inches of that really, really fine, fluffy, bright green seaweed, just covering the entire bottom of Sendiconnecticut. So there were no baby eelgrass. And so that's back to, like, if the water quality isn't good enough, if the habitat is now bad because the eelgrass has been gone for too long, the seeds aren't going to take on their own. Just like you can't cut down a bunch of trees and strip away all the topsoil and throw down grass seed and think it's something, your flowers are going to grow. So the habitat still has to be right. So it's not going to be easy, and we just know that. And so what we have gotten so far, and we're still going to need some more permits before we plant anything on the bottom. And I'm nervous. I'm not sure how far those permits are going to have to go. But so far from the town of Tisbury, we have gotten it's about a 1 acre, no fishing, no anchoring zone out in the lagoon. So that we can use this space for restoration tools and no one will be in there disturbing it. And we got that for 5 years. So we have 5 years to really hammer away at this. And I know it's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because that's how eelgrass is right now. And see if we can get somewhere. And so we just know it's going to be hard, like I said, partially because the water quality is still poor. The visibility is still bad and the nitrogen's too high, but we're just trying to do our part so that as we, fine tune these things that we can do and that can be done around here, as the rest of us get our acts together and really help these ponds, we're all working on, comprehensive wastewater management plans and whatnot, that will be ready to help bring it back. And just like what we do with the shellfish restoration, sometimes, we grow 10 to 20 million scallops every year. And you all know that there aren't many scallops out there to be harvested. It's devastating. It's heartbreaking every winter for most of us in most of the towns, unless you live in Edgartown. But we have to keep doing what we do, because if we stop, then, and there are no scallops left anywhere, then the population never will be able to return if if the habitat ever does improve. Does that make sense? You know, shellfish spawn into the water, and then their embryos and their larvae travel and they swim for 1 to 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And so they move around, and they're not necessarily going to stay where they are. So where we used to have scallops all over the place, they were all contributing to each other's populations. And then as those little populations drop out one by one, there isn't the larval source to repopulate. So we have to keep this whatever minimum number that we possibly can in going in the pond, so that there are at least a few adults all over spawning every year, and hoping that some of them will take. Last thing on the scallop note, because this is a new thing for us this year. Sorry, it's kind of like a shift, but scallops and eelgrass are totally linked. Especially because there are fewer wild bay scallops to be fished. The oyster farmers are continuing to be really interested in growing bay scallops commercially on their farms as another product. This isn't anything new. You know, oyster farmers have been thinking about this for a long time, and they're very hard. Scallops are tricky. That's why they don't exist everywhere. They're picky about their conditions and their food. They can't be air dried or power washed. They can't be shipped around. You can't put them in the refrigerator overnight. And so they're also hard to grow on the farm. These farmers are having to find like modify the way they do things. But the first challenge that they're having is getting good seed. Because I had heard this last year from a couple of guys at Katama. They had bought stuff from other off-island hatcheries. Either their order was completely canceled because the hatchery culture failed, or they got their bay scallops and most of them just died during transport or the changing conditions. You know, who knows? One of them had to send a crew member up to Maine, spend a night in a hotel to pick up their bay scallops the first morning, get them all the way back to the vineyard, get them back in the water on the same day so that they didn't die. So this winter, we conditioned and spawned bay scallops in March for the first time. Rick also had never done this. So Chris Edwards is our hatchery manager. So Chris and I learned a lot. It was a lot harder than we thought it was going to be to heat that much water when the water is that cold, because they had to be completely closed systems where the water's all filtered and heated and adding all their food. You know, the shellfish group, like what Rick created for us, is a system that largely depends on the natural phytoplankton that's out there in the lagoon. And that's why, you know, I'm not a water quality specialist. That's why we, of course, like talk so much about water quality, because it impacts all of our work. And so it was really hard to have to grow that much food. But now the 3 new farms in the lagoon here all have some bay scallops they got from us very early in the season. And they're all doing really well. And they're learning how to grow them on in their new spaces, and hoping that they're going to have some bay scallops to sell in the markets or in the restaurants this winter. So keep your eyes out for, you know, cultured vineyard bay scallops. I know that one of them, Jeff Canna, was selling them to, I believe it was Beach Road, who last winter, who was like sauteing them and putting them in like pasta kind of thing, you know, like you do with little necks or mussels. So eating more of the scallop and enjoying like the beautiful shell and like the whole presentation of it, instead of just shucking out the mussel. So it's a whole new food. But if we want to continue to eat from the sea, and if we want people to continue to work in the water and earn their livings on the sea, we have to like contribute to like supporting them in their efforts. So that's what the shellfish group did. I hope they'll be really successful, and they'll want so many bay scallops that we can't grow that many. We just did this, and we'll probably do it again next winter, just to try to get them on their feet and help them figure out if and how you know, growing bay scallops on their farms will work for them. So that was getting into heavy hatchery season really early in the season really impacted us as well. We are very tired. But summer's only half over, so we'll keep going. And you know, I could go on, but I think that that's pretty good. That's a lot of what we've been up to.
Well, you've been busy, to say the least, along with your other jobs.
Oh, no.
Well, anybody got questions? I have a question, but somebody else got something first? Don't see anybody. My question is, with those oysters that they couldn't sell because of COVID, will they just keep getting bigger and having babies forever? I mean, how big do they finally get and how long do they live eventually?
Well, it depends on where they are. You know, like my uncle tells stories of getting oysters out of Eggertown Great Pond that were, you know, the size of his boot. I think that, you know, I've heard that, you know, lobsters continue to grow essentially until they die. They don't have a determinate size. And I haven't heard that of oysters, but it almost seems to be true. They will just keep growing. But there's a lot of, as they get bigger as well, they also need a lot of food. So there's a lot of reasons why they end up, why they die. But so last year we got oversized ones from a couple of the farmers, planted them into Slough Cove and Eggertown Great Pond, where we are now actually, this year I just got a report that we're seeing some oyster set in Eggertown Great Pond, wild set, which we have not seen in a couple of years. And if we do see that in Tisbé Great Pond as well, then I'm going to say it's part of like the cycle. So all these things come in cycles. If we do not see that in Tisbé Great Pond, then I'm going to just hypothesize or just kind of claim that I think that they were really big, healthy oysters that did not have dermo disease, and the rest of the oysters in both great ponds have a lot of dermo disease.
Oh, no.
And when they have a lot of dermo disease, they're spending all their energy, you know, trying to fight this pathogen. It's a little parasite, doesn't hurt people, but it does kill the oyster. So they're spending all their energy fighting the parasite instead of creating gonad, which of course is super energy intensive. So.
Wow. Yeah, well, there was some big ones last winter out there. It's hard to find the perfect sizes, actually.
Yes, yes.
But they all tasted good.
Yeah.
In fact, this is an interesting story. I just came back from a wedding in Montana, and somebody, well, it was put on by parents. It's people who live on the vineyard and all that. So anyways, they had some oysters shipped, not from the vineyard, it was close, but from somewhere further up the coast of Massachusetts. And they were so small. It was like, what are you doing with these small oysters, you know?
The petite market is really big now. I just heard a story just a couple days ago. It was one of the Katama growers wanted to be able to sell their oysters to Island Creek. And Island Creek is this collaborative through, you know, in Duxbury, Mass.
Maybe that's where it's from. Might have been from there.
And so what Duxbury said was, Island Creek said, your oysters are too big. We can't sell them. Huh. Of course, I mean, I'm like, if I'm going to pay $3 for an oyster, I want to need like a fork and a knife. But yeah. Petites are where the market is at right now. And in Katama, for example, the oysters grow so fast. I don't know if any of them could grow a petite, even if they really wanted to, because they grow so fast.
Wow, interesting.
Well, in Katama, you could grow a petite. You'd get it in June, and you'd have the petite by August.
Yeah, but it would still be a seed, so it would be kind of flat, right? It may not have that cup to it unless you really, really worked it, unless you did a lot of humbling or whatever.
I'm old fashioned. All the petites are seed.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Anybody else got any questions? Not seeing anybody. So Sherry, we got anything else specifically on the agenda?
Not that I know of. Next month is August and our meeting will fall right on the fair. So I would like to put it to you, maybe we skip August or move it around.
I'm all for taking a month off.
Yeah, me too.
Seems like everybody else is taking a month off, so.
Yeah. I also have to, I'm helping Oak Bluffs get the fireworks going. And so that same week then will be fireworks. So I definitely won't be at Water Alliance the day before fireworks.
Oh, boy. The poor oysters are gonna be so upset. Bang,
Oh, I
crash.
know.
What's that noise? What's that noise?
What exactly are you doing to to assist Oak Bluffs in the fireworks?
Well, so the Oak Bluffs fireworks have always been,
Yeah, the fire department.
right, and the fire department's not doing it. It was the Firemen's Civic Association, and they're not doing it. So the town of Oak Bluffs is doing the whole fireworks. And they were like, we need to make a committee. Who wants to lead this committee? I was like, sure. Awful. But it's the fireworks, so it's gonna be the same as it always is, but
I'm glad.
so I have like this 6-inch thick folder of what has gone into this since like the 90s, and I'm hurting all the people.
Wow. Well, good for you. We appreciate that. I think everybody's
Absolutely.
so happy to have the fireworks back.
It's
I told
funny, man. You think that I didn't care, but I missed it.
But I told everybody that in the future, we're gonna go carbon neutral with our fireworks, because they're really not, they're not very good for the environment, and it's really upsetting. So
How do you go carbon neutral? Do they have such a product?
Sydney, Australia did it. I'm not really sure what it involves yet.
Right, right.
Yeah, it's funny. There was so much fireworks on the July 4th and into the night by private people. I was having the same thoughts. Come on, this can't be good. Can't be good for what's ailing us.
Yep. Nope.
Well, good luck, Emma.
No, thanks.
Okay,
Thank you, Emma, for your presentation.
let's
Thank you,
go to the
everyone.
beach now.
Thanks all.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Go get cold in the ocean.
Thanks all. Take care.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, everybody. See you.
Bye-bye.